In this unit, we're going to be covering what is often referred to as the Roaring Twenties. And normally we'll write down the time period that we're working with, but I think this one is pretty self-explanatory that we're dealing with the 1920s here. So starting with this first slide with information, I want you to understand the presidents that we're going to get in the 1920s are going to be presidents like Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And those three are going to be a little bit different than the ones in one of our previous units known as the Progressive Era, Teddy, Taft, and Wilson. Teddy, Taft, and Wilson are going to be the first ones that we see move away from a laissez-faire type of government. And you can see here with Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, we have their laissez-faire. They're going to believe in less government involvement in the economy and in businesses. They also believe in raising tariffs and something called trickle-down economics. Now, jumping down here to trickle-down economics, to get you to understand this is typically more of a Republican view on how to help stimulate the economy, a struggling economy. And what trickle down is the belief that we should cut taxes for this upper class here, the wealthy, the big businesses, the corporations, and things like that, with the hopes that once we cut taxes for those people, that they will use those excess funds to grow their companies, pay their workers more. And what we'll start to see is, I'm going to highlight the arrows here, the wealth that started up top is going to trickle down to not only the middle class workers, but also to many in the poor and low class. So that is what trickle-down economics is. Down here, a little bit of specifics about these three presidents that we get. Harding, very common slogan known as return to normalcy. Now, what he's talking about here is this is after we have experienced so many changes with the progressive era and more government. We've just gotten out of World War I, where there was a ton of government control over industry, what you could and could not buy, what you could and could not say. And so he's going to say we're not only going to return to a society where the government is going to be less involved, we're going to be returning to laissez-faire. Please don't forget, he says we're also returning to isolationism. And that is the reason why we did not join the League of Nations at the end of World War I. We're going to return back to this policy of minding our own business, staying away from Europe especially, because Europe has a history of liking to fight. Sadly, Harding is known for scandals throughout his administration. Though he was not involved in those scandals, many members of his cabinet were. So he kind of gets the blame because these are the guys that he has hired. Many of them friends that he had from back in Ohio. That's called the Ohio Gang. Albert Fall specifically is going to be the one who gets in trouble for the Teapot Dome scandal. And again, though Harding was not a part of this scandal and by any means, because Albert Fall was somebody that he had given this position to, it kind of just makes his reputation falter in a sense. And sadly, Harding, probably due to the stress that a lot of his friends, that Ohio gang, gave him, he dies while he's in office, which is going to lead us to Coolidge, most commonly known as Silent Cal. He's going to be a hands-off kind of guy as well. And one of the famous quotes that he's known for is the chief business of the American people is business, which when you look at it, doesn't make very much sense at all. But ultimately, if you can remember that he's a laissez-faire, he's a hands-off kind of person, he's meaning here that that is what to expect from him, that America is going to thrive off of a free market where the government is not going to be standing over and controlling these big industries. And then we're going to lead into a guy by the name of President Herbert Hoover. He's going to play a key role in our next unit, which sadly is the Great Depression. And it's important to note that his policy, known as rugged individualism, is a clear representation of his laissez-faire views. Rugged individualism is do not be dependent on the society of, do not be dependent on government Instead, get out there, make things happen. Your success is going to be your own, your failure is going to be your own. And sadly, because of this approach, when the Great Depression hits and our economy begins its severe collapse, he's going to kind of cling to his laissez-faire and his rugged individual philosophy a little too long. And by the time that he decides to kind of sway against and get government a little bit more involved in the economy during the Great Depression, there's been too much damage that's been done, and he's going to be credited with giving too little, too late aid to the Great Depression. Over here, jumping to, I'm going to switch out colors as well. Jumping to, let's use this color. Nativism is, again, this is something we've had in our Gilded Age unit. This is the dislike of foreigners. Xenophobia is going to be the fear of foreigners, kind of along the same lines as nativism. And from past units, just to review, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which the name gives it away, is going to exclude the Chinese, and it was originally set for 10 years, but we're going to see this often renewed, I think, for close to 40 or 50 years. We're going to be keeping the majority of Chinese immigrants from entering the United States of America. And then the Gentleman's Agreement is going to be another Asian immigration law. So make sure you know that the ones that we've had in place prior to the 1920s were specifically targeting Asians. Now we're fixing to see something completely different during the Roaring Twenties. For the first time, we are going to, with the Emergency Quota Act, and the next one is the National Origins Act. Most people just call it the Immigration Act of 1924. But you better know, this is extremely important, that specifically these laws were trying to limit the number of immigrants that we were getting in from Eastern and Southern Europe. Again, this is from a past unit. These immigrants are called new immigrants. They're the ones who are flooding our eastern shore during the Gilded Age. And very important, again, to note that in the 1920s, these immigration laws, the Emergency Quota Act and the Immigration Act of 1924, used quotas. They used different censuses from prior years and determined a set number, a quota, a limit is another way of thinking about that, on how many immigrants from specific countries we're going to allow in each year. And when we meet that limit, there can be no more immigrants coming in. We're going to see a resurgence of the KKK in the 1920s. And to be honest with you, the KKK kind of fizzled out, were not as well known and not as prominent since the end of the Civil War and during that Reconstruction period and things like that. But the KKK here is going to reemerge in the 1920s, and of course they're going to keep all of their views of being anti-abortion, anti-Catholic, anti-Black, and we're going to make sure that in the 1920s their main focus is actually going to be, I'm going to highlight it down here, immigration. So this KKK, they're going to be a huge supporter of these laws limiting immigrants coming in. And then an example of how much nativism was infesting our country during the 1920s, there's the case of, I believe it's called Sacco and Vanzetti. And these were two Italian immigrants, so let's make sure we understand what they are. They're Italian immigrants, so that's one thing that they've got going against them, especially with nativism being so common. They're anarchists, and anarchist was seen as being obviously un-American, as a threat. Anarchists do not believe in an authoritative government by any means. And they were World War I draft dodgers. They dodged the draft during World War I and were not willing to fight for the country, so they're kind of seen as being unpatriotic. And then, so the combination of these things, these men are already not one of the most popular subjects in our country. And they're going to be accused of armed robbery and murder. And the sad thing is when they were accused of armed robbery and murder, there was very little evidence that they actually committed the crime. Yet they were found guilty and executed for the crime that they were accused of. I'm pretty sure that since then, we're pretty confident that they did, in fact, do this armed robbery and murder. But to be honest with you, at the time, them being Italian immigrants, anarchists, and World War I draft dodgers, that is most likely the reason, surrounded by, I highlighted it at the very, very bottom there, nativism, that they were found guilty. Because again, how our justice system is supposed to work is there is supposed to be substantial evidence against you for you to be found guilty of a crime as heinous as murder. And there was very little. So who they were played a huge role in their conviction. Moving on to in the 1920s, we're going to see our first Red Scare. We get a Red Scare following World War I. We're going to see another Red Scare after World War II. And in our last unit, World War I, when Russia experienced the Russian Revolution, backs out of the war, and they turn into the Soviet Union, they establish the first communist nation under the dictatorship of Vladimir Lenin. And so we discussed that the color red from here on out is going to be symbolic of communism. And so the Red Scare in America is going to be the fear that communism is spreading throughout the United States. And there are very many reasons why. And if you jump over here to the section that says why, the first one is going to be that Russian Revolution I just mentioned. The fact that a country actually experienced a war, people threw over the government, and they established a communist nation. It's reality at this point. Like, it can be done. And so that's going to get our attention because, you know, we have Karl Marx in the past that talked about socialism and communism, and pretty much it had only been an idea, but Russia doing it and turning into the Soviet Union made it a reality. There was a communist party in the United States of America. It was not illegal to be communist. It was just pretty much frowned upon, kind of like, why would you do that? And during World War I and afterwards, we're going to see the membership in that political party increase. And so this is going to kind of scare us a bit because obviously communism is looking attractive to some people. We're going to see a lot of labor unrest, and I want to write that out to the side of what I just highlighted. We often call this labor unrest in the United States of America after World War I. And the main reason for this is because we have World War I veterans returning home, and they're experiencing their jobs were taken. Some of them were taken by women. Some of them were taken by African Americans during the Great Migration. And a lot of these men were given their jobs back, but some were not. And the biggest thing that we're going to see, because there is no more demand from the government in these factories to produce war equipment, where wages had increased drastically during the war, wages are going to drop again. And a lot of workers are going to be upset. They're going to go on strike. Now, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with the Red Scare? What does this have to do with communism? What we're doing here is we're comparing this to what happened in Russia during the Russian Revolution. The unrest came from the working population in Russia. So we're just kind of seeing a correlation between this and what happened in Russia leading to their fall to communism. And also, ironically, there were actually some terrorist attacks, some bombs being placed in some people's homes, mailed to their addresses and things like that. And we're going to directly relate that to communism and this threat. And then race riots, again, mostly over job competition and stuff up north. And what this is going to lead to, it's actually going to lead to the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer is actually one of the men that one of those bombs was mailed to. And he is going to lead, as I believe his position was attorney general. And he is going to work with the FBI, and he is going to lead these raids known as the Palmer raids. Of course, they're named after him, where their plan is to go around and round up anybody they see as a potential threat, anybody considered to be un-American. So it was a lot of socialists, I'm going to highlight that, and especially anarchists like Sacco and Vanzetti were, and communists. And the goal is most of these are going to be immigrants that came in from Eastern and Southern Europe. That's another reason why we see a major push to have immigration laws keeping these people out. And when they are rounded up, they're thrown in jail with no evidence that they've committed any crime. And again, remember, it's not illegal to be an anarchist. It's not illegal to be a communist or a socialist. It's just frowned upon. And many of these guys were deported. And the sad thing is this is a clear violation of their rights. But an ongoing theme in this class is when the government has to choose, we saw this in World War I, between protecting your freedoms or protecting the nation, often called national security, or protecting our economy, they're going to choose to throw your freedoms to the side. They're going to worry about national security. They're going to worry about our economy over freedoms at any point. And so down here at the bottom, it says the raids infringed on people's civil liberties, like I just said. But, let me move that. The security of the nation is going to take priority over your freedoms. So that's how they get away from this. And then moving on over here to the side, again, I want to change colors again. Let's do pink. Consumerism is going to be extremely popular in the 1920s, where people are going to be buying more products than they ever bought before. Mass production, up here in this little dotted box, is going to allow a lot of products to be affordable to not just the wealthy, but the middle class. And some products that are really, really, really going to change people's lives, especially the housewife. I'm going to go ahead and highlight there. Is the washing machine. It's going to cut down on her chores. The vacuum cleaner, again, is going to cut down on the time that she's cleaning. And canned goods is very important because a lot of women are going to be spending less time in the kitchen working with fresh produce and fresh things like that. They're going to be able to throw casseroles together within a few minutes, pop it in the oven, and have supper well on its way to being ready. Now, normally, cooking and cleaning and things was an all-day task for these women to where they had very little spare time. But down here, you see leisure time. All of these new technologies that they're going to be investing in the 1920s are going to allow women to have leisure time, spare time to spend outside of the traditional cooking and cleaning role that women were expected to do at home. More important technologies that you need to know are the radio. And you have got to understand the impact that the radio had on mass culture. So highlighting some things down here. Mass culture is when people, through forms of media, and in this case the radio, in the 1950s it's going to be the TV, are going to, instead of culturally being so different, it's going to be something that ties us together and brings us together. And we're going to start acting more like each other than not liking each other. And I always give the example of social media today and TikTok and things like that, where we see, since we are exposed to so many of the same things, we're starting to see trends and stuff all over our country because of what we're seeing together in the masses on social media. Advertising is going to be a very popular industry in the 1920s, trying to get people, the consumers, to go out and buy these products that, to be honest, they probably didn't necessarily need, but that is going to be the job of the advertising industry, is convincing these people, hey, you need to go buy this. Another important, very, very important technology that's now affordable during the 1920s is the automobile, specifically the Model T. And the Model T was done by Henry Ford, and the reason that it is so affordable is because he was able to mass produce it using his method known as the assembly line. And this industry booming because there were so many products needed to make the automobile, like rubber. And we're going to see that if automobiles are going to be increasing, we're going to be needing roads constructed. So every industry connected to that, that this industry is going to have a huge impact on other businesses and a huge contribution to our economy in the 1920s. And then, very important to note, because automobiles are going to be affordable, a lot of middle class and wealthy are going to buy these automobiles, and they no longer have to live in the innermost part of the city where it was more congested and the crime rate is higher and things like that. Now that they don't have to live so close to their job and to stores and things, we're going to see a migration. We're going to see a movement out of the inner cities into a place we often call the suburbs. And down here at the very bottom, kind of wrapping up what we are seeing here with consumerism in the 1920s and all this buying, it's important for you to note that as good as the economy appeared it was in the 1920s, the average American still couldn't afford to go out and pay full price for these products. So what we're going to see is something called buying on credit. This is going into debt, borrowing money to go afford these products. They would go borrow money to get the radio. And how they would pay for this is through something known as installment plans, which is broken up into small monthly payments so that it's a little bit more manageable to have. So that's going to be very important when we go over our next unit, the Great Depression, and what causes the Great Depression. One of those causes is the outstanding amount of consumer debt that we get in the 1920s. And that advertising industry played a huge role in, convincing Americans, especially middle class families, hey, you need the automobile. You need the radio and everything. So what's going to happen is a lot of people, especially this happens even today, are going to get in over their head with the amount of money that they borrow just to have these new technologies. We're on the second to last page in this unit, and we're going to see in the 1920s that there is going to be a huge challenge to what we call as traditional views. The traditional views, the traditional gender roles, that women belong at home, they need to be modest, long hair, no makeup, things like that, go to church, and things, Christianity is often tied to traditionalism, and we're going to see that being challenged with more modern views. And I'm going to actually jump over here to the side where we have the Scopes Monkey Trial and the New Woman, and these are going to be two examples of traditional views being challenged by modern values that we start to see pop up, especially in cities during the 1920s. So an example is with the Scopes Monkey Trial, and this happens in Tennessee, where a teacher by the name of John T. Scopes is going to break what is known as the Butler Act in Tennessee. And in his science class, in his biology class, he's going to teach the theory of evolution. Now, why that is unusual is because, especially most southern states, when they taught about how humans were created, they taught what we know as creationism. They got out the Bible, they looked at the book of Genesis and how God created Adam, and then from Adam, he took a rib and created Eve. That is creationism. And then we're going to see John T. Scopes here is going to teach what is known as a theory of evolution, which was a clear violation of the Butler Act. You could not teach evolution in the state of Tennessee. And he knew that, and this was all planned. And the plan was for him to teach this, and an organization that was teaming up with him, they were going to provide him a lawyer to fight this. And their goal was to bring awareness to the fact that science and religion do not mix. So he's going to be put on trial. And it's pretty simple case. The Butler Act said don't teach evolution. He taught evolution. He's going to be found guilty, but again, that wasn't the point. The point was to bring awareness. And when we get people like, and I want to go ahead and write his name here because he comes from a past unit, we get people like William Jennings Bryan. And he's going to be the prosecutor in this case that, of course, is trying to find Scopes guilty, which, again, was not very difficult to do. But he kind of put his foot in his own mouth when they put him on the stand. And he's supposed to be a fundamentalist. And the question of creation and the days comes into effect. So ultimately, people across the nation are actually going to begin to question not necessarily that creationism is wrong, but does it belong in a biology classroom? And they're going to start to see that a lot of states that were teaching creationism in the classroom, in a biology setting, in a science setting, are going to switch to teaching evolution. And how they're going to kind of justify this, many of them not believing in evolution, they believe that it was okay to be taught as long as it was taught as a theory. And then, of course, down here we have the new woman. These girls were called flappers, and they are, again, a prime example of how that traditional woman is being challenged. So right here we have our traditional woman. She's pretty much covered from collarbone to wrist to ankle bone. She didn't wear makeup. She had long hair, though she pinned it up. She definitely didn't smoke. She definitely didn't drink. To be honest with you, nobody's supposed to be drinking in the 1920s because we're going through prohibition. We'll learn on the next slide how that was a complete failure anyways. And then we're going to get this flapper, as you can see on the left here, where she's going to start wearing dresses above the knee, and that's going to be considered so scandalous, showing her elbows, and if she wants to be extra scandalous, you might even see some shoulder action. She's going to cut and dye her hair. She's going to smoke, and she's going to drink specifically liquor, what they kind of consider to be more of a hard alcohol. And she's just the complete opposite of that traditional woman and style that was being pushed on the average American woman. Wrapping up this page, we're going to see prohibition in the 1920s. Again, tying in some stuff from a past unit. The Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. They're going to be two groups that push for temperance, banning alcohol. And they're going to be successful. We're going to get the passage of the 18th Amendment. And that is going to ban the sale, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol. And one of the main goals is going to be... they believe it's going to reduce crime, and it's going to fix a lot of the problems in these urban areas, in these cities. And we're going to learn that didn't happen, but that was the original theory. Domestic violence is going to decrease, and, crime in general in these cities is going to have to decrease because they genuinely believed it was tied to the so much access to alcohol. The Volstead Act is going to be a law that gives the government authority to oversee prohibition and to enforce it. It wound up being very expensive for our government to afford this process. And then the biggest impact that you have got to remember about prohibition is it had the exact opposite effect of what it originally intended. Where they thought crime would decrease, specifically organized crime like gangsters, like Al Capone and things like that in these inner cities is going to increase. They're going to start claiming turf, and they're going to start making and selling alcohol illegally. And it's just going to be a complete disaster. So again, the whole purpose behind the 18th Amendment was a failure. Eventually, we're going to see, let's make sure we highlight bootleggers and speakeasies, these people who made alcohol illegally. Speakeasies were those hidden bars. And then in the future, specifically during the Great Depression, we're going to reverse prohibition with the 21st Amendment. And how I remember that is 21st is the age that you can legally drink, and the 21st Amendment is going to make it to where you can legally drink again after prohibition. Over here, we're going to get the Lost Generation authors. You need to be familiar with the names. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner. John Steinbeck is sometimes thrown into this group. And these men heavily, and it's bolded here, criticized this new modern consumer lifestyle of the 1920s. As a matter of fact, some of them were so dissatisfied with this new culture that we're seeing in the 1920s that they're going to pack up and move to Europe. So these Lost Generation authors, very important. They wrote about things in the 1920s that they didn't agree with, most of it tied to this new consumer culture. And then we have, thanks to, I'm going to go ahead and highlight it, the Great Migration, we're going to have a blossoming, that's the word they often use, of African American culture, specifically in the arts, up in Harlem, which is located in the Upper West Side of New York's Manhattan Island, as it says there. You need to be familiar with the names. You need to be able to see these names on your test and, okay, that's a Harlem Renaissance artist. Especially names, I'm going to highlight very specific ones: Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and then a new one that I have seen added to your standard is Ella Fitzgerald. These people did a variety of things. Some people wrote poems, some people sang, some people were just jazz musicians and things like that. But one thing that they all centered around was the African American culture and bringing awareness to it, but especially the poetry was centered around the struggles that African Americans had in a white-dominated American society, and bringing awareness to a variety of different struggles, from southern plantations to freed slaves to Jim Crow to children, African American children being discriminated against in schools and things like that. So again, this Harlem Renaissance is all centered around the African American culture, and we're going to see a lot of black nationalism come out of this, pridefulness in this black culture, and proud of being black and where they're coming from, and hopefully where they're going with new freedoms and new civil rights, as that's going to be approaching in the near future. So make sure, again, and that's made possible through that Great Migration during World War I and afterwards, where a lot of African Americans left the South and moved up north, mostly to take advantage of these jobs. But a lot of them, many of them are going to settle in this region or this area known as Harlem.